Tonight we're going somewhere quiet. The coast of North Carolina, in August 1590. A man named John White has just stepped ashore after 3 years away. He's been calling out names for 20 minutes. Nobody is answering. The settlement is there, or rather, the bones of it are. The houses have been taken apart, carefully, deliberately. Possessions are scattered in the grass. Chests have been opened, their contents tumbled out, weathered by years of rain and heat. The garden has gone to seed. The fence still stands, most of it, anyway, and carved into one of the fence posts, in letters White would later describe as fair Roman letters, one word, CROATOAN. No bodies, no graves, no signs of a battle, no blood on the ground, no note, no explanation, no voices calling back from the treeline. Just silence and the sound of the Atlantic behind him, and that one word, and the fact that he knows, he has always known deep down, that he has been gone far too long. His daughter is somewhere. His granddaughter is somewhere. 115 people are somewhere. He just has to figure out where. Before we go any further into that silence, I want to say something quick. If you're new here, welcome to the Still Hour. This is a channel about history and mystery and the quiet hours of the night. And if this is the kind of thing that makes you want to pull a blanket up and listen for a while, then please consider subscribing and hitting the like button. It genuinely helps more than you know, and it means that when you suggest topics, which I love when you do, by the way, because some of our best episodes have come from comments, I know you're out there listening. And speaking of out there, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is. There is something I genuinely love about knowing that someone in Edinburgh and someone in Sao Paulo and someone in a small town in Ohio are all, at this exact moment, lying in the dark thinking about the same strange, lost thing. That makes me feel like we're all sitting around the same fire. So tell me where you are. All right. The light is going. Turn off the lights. Pull the blanket up. And think about what it would feel like to come back to a place where you left people you loved and find nothing. No note. No grave. No explanation. Just a word carved in wood and the sound of the Atlantic. That is the feeling we're sitting with tonight. Not terror, exactly. Something quieter and older than terror. The feeling of absence. The feeling of a question that has never, in 430 years, been fully answered. Let that feeling settle over you like the dark settles over a room when you close the last lamp. We're in good hands. We're going slowly. And this is a very, very old mystery. Here are some of the questions I want you to hold tonight. Don't try to answer them yet. Just let them open. What happened to 115 people? Where do you go when you are on an island at the edge of the known world, and the ships stop coming, and the months stretch into a year, and then 2, and then 3? Where do you go when there is, in any practical sense, nowhere to go? Did they survive? Not as an abstract historical question, but really, did they live? Did children grow up who were born on that island? Did someone, somewhere, carry the memory of what it felt like to be English and lost in a new world? Did they choose to leave Roanoke, or were they driven out? Is there a difference when you are hungry and frightened and the ships aren't coming? What does CROATOAN mean, and why that word? Why carved there? Why nothing else? Why not an arrow? Why not a cross, the prearranged signal for distress? Why just the one word, calm and deliberate, as if it were the most natural thing in the world? Why did John White take 3 years to come back? He loved these people. His own blood was among them. What kept him? And what would you do, be honest, in the dark, right now? What would you do if you came home after years away to a place where everyone you loved had simply stopped being there? Not dead. Not gone in some explicable way. Just absent. As if they had stepped through a door in the air and it had closed behind them. Hold those questions. We'll walk through them together. To understand Roanoke, you have to understand the world that sent those people there. England in the 1580s. Queen Elizabeth I on the throne, brilliant, cautious, vain, politically cunning in a way that was almost supernatural. The Protestant faith newly established, newly threatened, the entire country aware that its religious identity was fragile and its international position more fragile still. Spain, under Philip II, is the dominant empire in the Western world. Spain has gold. Spain has silver. Spain has the treasuries of the Aztec and Inca empires funneled back across the Atlantic in galleon after galleon, and that wealth is making Spain into something England cannot match in a straight fight. England has something else, though. England has Walter Raleigh. And Raleigh has a charter, granted by Elizabeth herself, to go and find England its own foothold in the New World. The place chosen, a long, low island off the coast of what the English call Virginia, named for their Virgin Queen, naturally, because even geography was a form of flattery in the Elizabethan court. The island's name is Roanoke, and in 1585, the first English colonists set sail toward it. The first attempt fails. The men are brought home by Francis Drake, who happens to be passing through after raiding Spanish settlements, and they are glad to go. A second attempt comes in 1587, and this time it is different. This time, families come. Women come. Children come. People who are meant to stay, meant to build, meant to make something that lasts. Among them, John White, artist and cartographer and newly appointed governor of the colony, and his daughter Eleanor, and Eleanor's husband, Ananias Dare, and Eleanor's unborn child, who would become, in August of 1587, the first English child born in the Americas. And then White goes back to England for supplies. And the ships stop coming. And 3 years pass. And when he finally returns, there is only silence and a fence post and one word. Let's start where everything starts, with the world as it was before any of this happened, because it matters, it really does, to understand what England was feeling in the 1580s. And the word I keep coming back to is hunger. Not physical hunger, though there was plenty of that too. A different kind of hunger. The hunger of a country that can see the banquet and hasn't yet been given a seat at the table. Spain, by the 1580s, is astonishing. That is genuinely the word. The sheer scale of what Spain had accomplished in the Americas in just a few generations was something that contemporaries found almost incomprehensible. Hernán Cortés and his small, brutal army had brought down the Aztec Empire in the 1520s. Francisco Pizarro had done the same to the Inca in the 1530s. And in the decades that followed, the gold and silver that poured back from those conquered civilizations had made Spain the richest and most powerful nation in Europe, possibly in the world. The Spanish crown was funding wars, building fleets, projecting power across the entire globe, and doing all of it on the backs of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, whose suffering was immense and largely invisible to the people in London who looked at Spain's wealth and felt that hunger. England was not nothing in the 1580s. Elizabeth's court was brilliant, creative, intellectually alive in a way that still astonishes. But England was Protestant in a Catholic world, perpetually short of money, perpetually conscious of vulnerability. The Spanish Armada hadn't happened yet, but the threat of it was in the air. Philip II of Spain was biding his time. And meanwhile, English privateers, which is a polite word for pirates with a government license, were raiding Spanish shipping in the Caribbean and bringing back whatever they could grab. It was profitable, but it was also precarious. Raiding is not the same as owning. What England needed, or what men like Walter Raleigh believed it needed, was a permanent presence in the Americas. A base. A colony. Somewhere that English ships could resupply, English settlers could establish themselves, and England could begin to build its own version of what Spain had built, though few people at the time stopped to examine that comparison too closely, because what Spain had built had required the destruction of entire civilizations. Walter Raleigh is one of those figures from history who is so extraordinary, so perfectly suited to his era, that he almost seems fictional. He was a courtier, an explorer, a poet, a soldier, a schemer, a visionary, and one of Elizabeth's great favorites. A man who understood that in the Elizabethan court, appearance and reality were deeply intertwined, and who played that game brilliantly for decades. The famous story of him laying his cloak over a puddle so the queen would not muddy her shoes is almost certainly apocryphal, but it captures something true about him. The theatrical gesture, the personal loyalty, the understanding that winning Elizabeth's favor was its own kind of art. Raleigh never actually went to Roanoke himself. This is important. He was the vision behind the enterprise, the man who obtained the royal charter in 1584, granting him the right to discover, search, find out, and view such remote heathen and barbarous lands, countries, and territories not actually possessed of any Christian prince. That phrase, not actually possessed of any Christian prince, is doing an enormous amount of work, quietly erasing the actual ownership of those lands by the people who had been living on them for thousands of years. But we'll come back to that. What Raleigh wanted was a base on the American coast from which English privateers could harry Spanish shipping in the Caribbean and along the trade routes. That was the strategic vision. The colonial vision, the idea of building actual English communities in the New World, was secondary to that military and economic goal, at least at first. But Raleigh was also genuinely excited by the Americas, by the idea of what they represented, by the accounts he'd read of extraordinary landscapes and peoples and possibilities. There was real idealism mixed in with the calculation, as there usually is in these things. In 1584, Raleigh sent an expedition under Philip Amatus and Arthur Barlow to scout the American coastline. They came back with enthusiastic reports, and with two men from the coastal peoples, Manteo and Wanchese, who came to England and were dressed in English clothes and presented at court and generally treated as evidence that the Americas were ready and waiting for English attention. Manteo and Wanchese, for their part, were navigating something genuinely extraordinary, finding themselves in a world as alien to them as the moon, surrounded by people who alternately regarded them as exotic curiosities and potential diplomatic assets. The reports from Amatus and Barlow were, as Raleigh needed them to be, very positive. The coast was beautiful. The people seemed friendly. The island of Roanoke seemed well-placed. England, already buzzing with the excitement of discovery, heard these reports and felt itself on the edge of something historic. And in the excitement, in the genuine, palpable excitement of an era that believed the world was opening up like a flower, almost nobody stopped to ask the question that mattered most. What do the people who already live there think about all of this? The first Roanoke colony arrived in 1585, and you can think of it as a kind of shadow. Everything that happened to it, every mistake and act of violence and catastrophic decision, would fall across the second colony like darkness falls across a landscape ahead of a storm. You can't understand what happened in 1587 without understanding what happened in 1585. The second colony inherited the consequences of the first. The expedition was led by Ralph Lane, a military man, aggressive and impatient in the way that military men of that era often were when they found themselves in situations that required diplomacy rather than force. There were about 108 men in the first colony, soldiers, craftsmen, a handful of scientists and artists, including John White, who came along as the expedition's official artist and cartographer, making careful, beautiful drawings of the coastline and the people and the animals he encountered. White's watercolors of the coastal people survive to this day, and they are extraordinary, precise, empathetic, detailed in a way that reflects genuine curiosity and something approaching genuine respect, which makes them unusual documents of their era. The relationship between the first colonists and the local Croatoan and Roanoke peoples was, at the very beginning, one of cautious mutual interest. The coastal Algonquian peoples of the Carolina Outer Banks had complex social structures, sophisticated agricultural systems, rich spiritual lives, and centuries of experience navigating relationships between different groups. They were not, to put it plainly, the simple or credulous people that Raleigh's promotional literature implied. They watched the English arrive with a mixture of curiosity, calculation, and almost certainly a degree of wariness that proved entirely justified. The English, to their credit in these early weeks, did try to establish productive relationships. Manteo, who had returned to the Americas with the colonists, served as interpreter and cultural intermediary, and his role was crucial. Without him, communication would have been almost impossible. Through Manteo, Lane negotiated an arrangement with Wingina, the paramount chief of the Roanoke people, for the colonists to live on the island and receive food. It was an uneasy arrangement from the beginning. The English needed more food than they could produce themselves. They were dependent on the goodwill of people they barely understood and mostly did not respect, and that dependence made them anxious. Anxious men with weapons are dangerous. The winter of 1585 to 1586 was difficult. Supplies were short. The colonists were consuming far more of the local food stores than the arrangement with Wingina had accounted for. Relationships deteriorated. There were incidents, misunderstandings, accusations, the kind of slow accumulation of mistrust that builds when two groups of people need each other but cannot quite trust each other. Wingina, watching the English struggle and seeing how much they depended on his people's goodwill, began to reconsider the terms of the relationship. And then things became catastrophic. The details are somewhat murky at 4 centuries remove, but what seems to have happened is this. Lane learned, or believed he had learned, that Wingina was planning some kind of coordinated action against the colonists, possibly with the help of neighboring peoples. Whether this was accurate intelligence or paranoid rumor, Lane didn't wait to find out. In June of 1586, he led a preemptive attack on Wingina's village. In the attack, Wingina was shot and wounded, and then, as he tried to run, killed. His head was cut off. Lane's men apparently brought it back to the fort. This is not a footnote in the history of the Roanoke colony. This is one of the central facts. The English had come, had eaten the local people's food, had been dependent on their goodwill, and when that goodwill began to falter, had killed their leader. The consequences of that would echo for years. Shortly after the attack on Wingina, Francis Drake appeared off the coast of Roanoke. Drake was returning from a spectacularly successful raiding expedition against Spanish settlements in the Caribbean and Florida. He had burned St. Augustine, which must have been an alarming thing to watch from offshore, and he stopped to check on the colonists. What he found was a colony that was exhausted, frightened, and desperate to go home. Lane's men made a quick decision. They accepted Drake's offer of passage and sailed back to England, arriving in the summer of 1586. But here is the detail that matters most for what comes later. When the first colony left, they did not leave cleanly. A separate relief expedition, sent by Raleigh, arrived just days after Lane's departure and found the island empty. The commander of that expedition, not wanting to leave nothing behind, left a small party of 15 men to hold the fort until the next colonists arrived. 15 men. On an island whose people had recently watched their chief be killed by the English. With limited supplies and no clear plan. When the 1587 expedition arrived, John White's expedition, the second colony, the one this story is really about, they came with instructions to pick up those 15 men and continue to the next planned settlement further up the coast. Instead of 15 men waiting for them, they found a single skeleton. And the bones of the fort. And silence. What had happened to the other 14 men was never established with certainty. Some accounts suggest they were killed. Others hint at other possibilities. But the bones of that one man, found on the island that White's colonists were now being asked to call home, were not an encouraging welcome. The first colony's failure was not an accident. It was the result of inadequate supplies, poor planning, and a fundamental failure to treat the indigenous people of the Carolina coast as people whose lives and communities mattered and whose responses to English aggression were predictable and legitimate. That failure would shape everything that came next. The second colonists arrived not to a blank slate but to a poisoned one, to relationships damaged by violence, to a landscape shadowed by broken trust, to a place where 15 men had already been lost and nobody quite knew why. This is the part where the story becomes, for me, something more than a historical puzzle. Because the second Roanoke colony is not, at its heart, a story about exploration or colonial ambition, though it is about those things too. It is a story about people. Specific, named, real human people who packed their lives into ships and sailed towards something they could not fully imagine, for reasons that were probably quite ordinary. The hope of land, of a new start, of something better. The reasons people have always moved toward the unknown. John White is the one we know best because of his art and his writing. He left behind more of himself than almost any other colonist. He was, in his early 50s by 1587, a man who had already been to the Americas once with the first colony, had made his beautiful drawings, had come home with a sense of both the genuine wonder and the genuine difficulty of what the English were attempting. He was appointed governor of what Raleigh called the city of Raleigh, optimistic name for an island settlement, and charged with leading the second attempt. He was a man of maps and images, a man who saw the world with unusual precision and recorded it with unusual care, and he was about to walk into the most significant failure of documentation in American history, watching something happen that he could not record and could not explain. His daughter Eleanor was perhaps in her early 20s. She was married to a man named Ananias Dare, a bricklayer from London, which I find endlessly touching, that the first English child born in the Americas was the granddaughter of an artist and the daughter of a bricklayer, people who built things, solid and beautiful things, with their hands. Eleanor was pregnant when the ships left England. She was going to have her first child on the edge of the known world, and she went anyway. Whatever you make of that, it speaks to something in Eleanor Dare's character that commands respect across 4 centuries. There were 115 settlers in total, though the exact number varies slightly in different sources. Among them were around 17 women and 9 children, which made this expedition meaningfully different from the first. You don't bring women and children to a military outpost. You bring them to a home. The presence of families signals intent. These people were not coming to raid and leave. They were coming to stay. We know some of their names. Beyond Eleanor and Ananias Dare, there was Roger Bailey, a man named Dionys Harvey and his wife Marjorie, a man named Richard Arthur, a man named Thomas Hewitt. There was a man named Martin Sutton. There was a woman named Alice Chapman. There was an Elizabeth Glane. These are not famous names. They are names that appear briefly in White's colony lists and nowhere else in the historical record, which is its own kind of haunting, people who existed fully, who had histories and habits and preferences and fears, who have been reduced by time and lost to a name on a roll call. Manteo came with the second colony too. The CROATOAN man who had been to England twice, who had navigated 2 worlds and carried the knowledge of both, who was essential to whatever hope the colonists had of re-establishing good relations with the coastal peoples. Raleigh, in an extraordinarily presumptuous gesture, granted Manteo the title Lord of Roanoke, as if the English had the authority to grant a man lordship over his own people's ancestral lands. But Manteo accepted, or appeared to accept, and his presence gave the colonists their best chance of something that wasn't conflict. And then, on the 18th of August 1587, somewhere in the settlement on Roanoke Island, in what building, attended by which women, we will never know, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter. They named her Virginia. Virginia Dare. The first English child born in the Americas. I want you to sit with that name for a moment, in the dark. Virginia Dare. Born on an island at the edge of the known world, to a woman who had sailed across an ocean while pregnant, in a settlement that was already having difficulties, in a year when England was bracing for the Spanish Armada, in a time when the word Americas still carried the charge of genuine, vertiginous strangeness. There was no precedent for Virginia Dare. She was the first. John White became a grandfather at the edge of the known world. He held his granddaughter. He had brought his family here. He had maps of this coastline, drawings of these trees, And now he had a granddaughter born on this soil, and that must have felt, in some complicated and overwhelming way, like the completion of something. 9 days later, the colonists asked him to leave. Things began to go wrong almost immediately after the colonists arrived, and when you understand the context, the poisoned legacy of the first colony, the damaged relationships, the isolation, it is almost impossible to be surprised. Not inevitable, perhaps. History is never quite inevitable. But the pressures on those 115 people were real and significant from the very first weeks. The site of Roanoke Island itself was problematic in ways that the English planners in London had perhaps not fully appreciated. The island sits inside the Carolina Outer Banks, a long chain of barrier islands that runs along the North Carolina coast, beautiful and strange, a thin strip of land between the Sound and the open Atlantic. The waters around Roanoke are shallow. Too shallow, in many places, for the deep draft ships that would bring supplies from England. Getting goods ashore required small boats making multiple trips, and in bad weather it was dangerous or impossible. As a strategic base for privateering in the deep Caribbean, Roanoke was poorly placed. As a permanent settlement that needed reliable supply lines, it was precarious. There was also the matter of the people who had lived on this land before the English arrived. The Roanoke people, whose chief Wingina had been killed by Ralph Lane's men the previous year, had not forgotten. Could not have forgotten, and would not have been expected by any reasonable person to have forgotten. The arrival of a new group of English people on the same island was not going to be received with open arms, and it wasn't. Within days of the second colony's arrival, a settler named George Howe was killed. He was found in the shallows, crabbing, just doing what you do when you need to eat, wading through warm water with a basket, in the ordinary way of a man who had probably gone crabbing many times before and expected to go many times again. He was found with 16 arrows in his body. He had been attacked by a group of men who had almost certainly been watching the English settlement with a mixture of fear, anger, and the accumulated memory of what the previous group of English people had done to their chief. George Howe's death is a tragedy in the original sense, not just sad, but the result of forces set in motion long before he arrived. Forces he had no direct part in creating. He was not Ralph Lane. He was not the man who killed Wingina. He was a settler, probably an ordinary man with ordinary reasons for being there, and he died in the shallows with 16 arrows in his body because the people whose land this was had no way of distinguishing between one group of English people and another. The colonists were frightened. Of course they were frightened. They had arrived to find the bones of their predecessors, and now one of their own was dead within weeks. They sent a delegation to the Croatoan people, Mantio's people, who had maintained a somewhat better relationship with the English, and tried to open diplomatic channels. The Croatoan told them what they already suspected. The Roanoke people and several allied groups were hostile. The situation was dangerous. What happened next was depressingly predictable. The colonists, responding to the threat of Roanoke hostility, launched a preemptive raid on what they thought was a Roanoke village. They were wrong about the village. They had mistakenly attacked a Croatoan settlement, killing people who were actually their most reliable potential allies. It was a disastrous error, and Mantio's diplomacy was the only thing that kept it from completely severing the one relationship the colonists had that was functional. In the middle of all of this, in the middle of the fear and the mistakes and the political complexity, John White was asked to return to England. The colonists had a very practical reason. They needed supplies more than they had brought, and they needed reinforcements, and they needed someone with standing in England to make that case to Raleigh. White was the governor. White knew Raleigh. White was the right person to go. But White didn't want to go. Not even a little. He argued against it. He pointed out, reasonably, that his going would give rise to rumors, that people would say the governor had abandoned his post, abandoned his colonists, left at the first sign of difficulty. He was also surely thinking of Eleanor, of Ananias, of Virginia, 9 days old, the first English child born in the Americas. He had just become a grandfather. His family was here. This was his project, his life's work, the thing he had sailed 2 oceans for. He did not want to leave. The colonists insisted. They signed a document, actually signed it, asking him to go, pledging that they understood why he was leaving and that they did not hold it against him. It was a kind gesture, or perhaps a practical one. They needed those supplies badly enough to send the one man they had who could realistically obtain them. White signed the document back, pledging to return as quickly as possible, and in late August of 1587 he left. He stood on the deck of the departing ship and looked back at Roanoke Island growing smaller behind him. His daughter was there. His granddaughter was there. The home he had built and the project he had poured himself into was there. And he was sailing away from it, telling himself it was temporary, telling himself he would be back in months, telling himself that responsible men sometimes have to leave the people they love in order to protect them. He did not know that it would be 3 years before he saw those shores again. He did not know, could not know, that he would never see Eleanor again, or Virginia, or any of the 115 people he was leaving behind. He stood on the deck and watched the island disappear into the Atlantic haze, and he believed, with the fierce, necessary belief of a man who cannot afford to think otherwise, that everything would be all right. 3 years. Before we talk about what those 3 years were, let's just hold the number for a moment. 3 years. In our world, 3 years is the time between major phone generations, the length of a standard job contract, the span of a few seasons of television. It doesn't sound like a long time. But if you are 115 people on an island at the edge of the known world, with finite supplies and strained relationships with the people around you, and a governor who said he would be back in months, 3 years is an eternity. 3 years is long enough for a baby to become a child who runs and speaks and has opinions. 3 years is long enough for a settlement to transform completely, or to fall apart completely, or to find some third path that no one planned and no one could have predicted. And 3 years is long enough for a man who loves his family to slowly go out of his mind with not knowing. John White arrived back in England in the autumn of 1587 and immediately began trying to get back. This is important to understand. He did not arrive home and get comfortable and forget. The picture some later accounts paint of White as negligent or uncaring is simply not supported by what we know. He tried. He kept trying. The world just kept refusing to cooperate. The first obstacle was the Spanish Armada, or rather, the threat of it. By 1587, everyone in England knew that Philip II of Spain was preparing something enormous. The intelligence was clear. A massive fleet was being assembled, and its purpose was the invasion of England. The Protestant nation, the Protestant queen, the Protestant experiment, all of it was to be swept aside by Spanish sea power in the service of the Catholic reconquest of England. The threat was existential. Elizabeth's government, not unreasonably, responded by commandeering every available ship. No vessel large enough to cross the Atlantic could leave English waters. White's attempts to organize a relief voyage were blocked. The ships he needed were the ships England needed for defense. Francis Drake launched his famous preemptive raid on Cadiz in early 1587, singeing the King of Spain's beard, as the phrase went, buying England time. But the Armada came anyway in 1588, and what followed was one of the most dramatic naval confrontations in European history. The Great Spanish Fleet, 130 ships carrying thousands of soldiers, moved up the English Channel in formation, and the English under Drake and Howard met them with smaller, faster ships and tactics that the Spanish had not anticipated. The storms that came afterwards scattered the Armada and destroyed more of it than the English guns had. Spain's great invasion failed. England celebrated. England breathed. England felt the peculiar relief of a country that has looked at catastrophe and survived it. And John White, who was surely relieved in the way that everyone was relieved, still had 115 people on an island off the coast of North Carolina who had now been waiting for more than a year. He went back to pleading for ships. He got, briefly, a small concession. In 1588, he was allowed to take 2 small vessels, not the fleet he needed, not the supply ships loaded with everything the colony required, but 2 small pinnaces with limited capacity. He loaded what he could. He set sail. He did not make it. The accounts are slightly murky, but what seems to have happened is that the commanders of the 2 ships became distracted by the possibility of prizes, Spanish vessels that could be captured and plundered, and the expedition devolved into attempted privateering that went badly, with one of White's ships badly damaged in a fight and the whole venture limping back to England with nothing accomplished. White was back in England. The supplies were not delivered. Another year passed. Can you imagine being John White in the winter of 1588 into 1589? Writing letters to Raleigh. Sitting in whatever room he occupied in whatever city he was in. Doing the arithmetic that he couldn't stop doing. How much food had they brought? How were the harvests on the island? Were the Croatoans still friendly? Was Eleanor all right? Was Virginia growing, the way children grow, through those explosive early years when everything changes so fast? Was Ananias holding things together? He had no way to know. There was no post to Roanoke Island. There was no word coming back, because there was no ship to bring it. White was in the strange purgatory of a parent who cannot reach his child, and the months kept passing, and the seasons kept turning, and 1589 became 1590, and still he had not gone back. Now let's turn around. Let's face the other direction. Let's think about what it was like to be on Roanoke Island during those 3 years. August 1587. The governor's ship disappears over the horizon. John White is gone. He'll be back in months, everyone agrees on that. It is inconvenient, his leaving, but manageable. There are supplies, there are structures, there is Manteo, there are plans. The baby is healthy. The summer is warm. They can do this. September, October. The ships don't come. November. The weather turns. The Outer Banks in winter is not brutal, not like an English winter, not like the winters further north on the American coast. But it is wet and cold, and the wind off the Atlantic has an edge to it. The supplies are being used. The colonists are hunting and fishing and foraging, learning as they go what this landscape offers and how to take it. December. Still no ships. The decisions they were making during those months, we simply do not know. We can speculate carefully. We know from the physical evidence, or the lack of it, that they eventually left Roanoke Island, or were removed from it. We know the settlement was taken apart deliberately, not in panic. We know the word Croatoan was carved. We can work backward from those facts toward the decisions that must have preceded them, but we cannot know the conversations, the arguments, the fears, the moments of despair, and the moments of stubborn hope. Did someone at some point in those 3 years suggest that the ships weren't coming? That White wasn't coming back? Not because he didn't care, but because something had gone wrong, because England's troubles had swallowed the Roanoke colony as surely as the Atlantic might swallow a small boat? Did someone say, "We need a different plan"? Did someone say, "We need to leave"? And if they decided to leave, how do you leave an island when you don't have ships large enough to sail back across the Atlantic? The answer is, you don't leave that way. You leave by going inland, by going to the mainland, by going to the people who know this landscape. The Croatoan, Manteo's people, the people to the south on Hatteras Island who had been the most consistently friendly to the English. The fires were the first thing he noticed. Signal fires on the shore, which should have meant people, which should have meant they were still there. John White called out across the water. Nobody called back. He'd been at sea for weeks. He'd watched the coastline of the Americas materialize out of the gray Atlantic haze the way it always did, slowly, like something deciding whether to reveal itself. And when he saw those fires burning on the shore of Roanoke Island in August of 1590, 3 years after he'd left, something in his chest must have loosened. Because fires mean warmth. Fires mean hands. Fires mean someone is home and someone knows you're coming and someone is ready to be found. But the fires burned without anyone tending them. And when White's men rowed the longboat to shore and set their boots in the sand of the Carolina coastline, they found a silence that had no bottom to it. He called out names. He called out the names of people he loved. His daughter Eleanor. His son-in-law Ananias. His granddaughter Virginia, who would have been 3 years old when he left and who would be 6 now, if she was alive, if she was there, if she was anywhere in this quiet forest that wasn't answering him. The settlement itself was still there, in a manner of speaking. The palisade fence they had built was still standing. But when White and his men walked inside, they found, and this is the detail that stops you cold, the detail that keeps historians awake, they found that the houses had been taken down. Not burned. Not destroyed. Not attacked and demolished in some sudden violence. They had been disassembled. Carefully. The planks and timber stacked or carried away. The structures simply gone, The way a house looks when you move out of it rather than when you flee it. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about the difference between a house that has been destroyed and a house that has been put away. There is intention in the second one. There is patience. There is the image of people working together, removing nails, stacking wood, making decisions, preparing for a journey rather than running from a threat. Possessions had been buried. Some had been carefully hidden. English items, tools, things that would have been heavy and impractical to carry into the wilderness. A few heavy iron bars. Some things that might have been valuables, cached with the expectation of return. This, too, is important. You don't bury things you expect to lose. You bury things you expect to come back for. White moved through the settlement slowly, the way you move through a room where something terrible might have happened but you're not sure yet. He was looking. He was reading the silence the way you read a page, looking for the word that makes everything else make sense. And then he found it, carved into one of the posts of the palisade fence, in clear and deliberate capital letters, CROATOAN. And nearby, on a tree, partially carved, as if someone had started and been interrupted, or had started and decided the first word was enough, the letters U. He stopped. He read it again. CROATOAN. Now, before White had left in 1587, before the ships had sailed back to England and the long, excruciating absence had begun, he had left instructions. He had been a careful man, a practical man, a man who knew how easily things could go wrong in the New World and who had tried to plan for contingencies. He told the colonists, "If you move, carve your destination into a tree or post. That way I will know where to look. And if you move under threat, if something forces you out, if there is danger, if you leave in fear rather than in choice, carve a cross above the word. A cross means distress. A cross means come quickly. A cross means something went wrong." White looked at the fence post. He looked at the tree. He looked at every surface nearby, with the eyes of a man who has been worrying for 3 years and is now conducting the most important reading of his life. There was no cross. CROATOAN. Just the word, clean and clear, with no symbol of distress above it. CROATOAN. That was the name of an island, roughly 50 miles to the south and east, a place now known as Hatteras Island. And it was also the name of the people who lived there. The CROATOAN people, one of the many native nations of the Carolina coast, and specifically the community of a man named Manteo, who had traveled to England twice, who had been friendly to the colonists, who had been something like a bridge between the English world and this one. The colonists knew the CROATOAN. The CROATOAN knew the colonists. There had been tensions with other nations, yes, there had been moments of danger and misunderstanding, but the CROATOAN had been allies. White read the word again. He let himself feel, just for a moment, something that might have been hope. Because the word on that post was not a message of catastrophe. It was a message of direction. It was an arrow, carved inward, pointing somewhere specific, pointing toward people the colonists trusted, pointing toward a place where they might have chosen to go. He called his daughter's name one more time. The forest gave him nothing back. The Atlantic rolled behind him. Somewhere in that silence, 115 people, and a 6-year-old girl who had been the first English child born in the Americas, who had been his whole heart when he left, were somewhere. Not here. But maybe somewhere specific. Maybe somewhere findable. He looked at his ships. He looked at the sky. He looked at the word on the post. He just needed to get to CROATOAN Island. The weather turned that night. There is a particular cruelty in the way history sometimes works, where the small and mechanical things, the storm, the season, the temper of a sea captain, become the hinge on which everything turns. John White stood on a ship in August of 1590, with a carved word pointing him to a specific island 50 miles away, with every reason to believe his daughter and granddaughter were alive and findable, and the weather said no. And the captains said no. And the season said no. And the Atlantic, indifferent as it has always been to the particular heartbreaks of the people crossing it, simply would not cooperate. The captains of White's ships had already been reluctant to come back at all. 3 years of delays in England, 3 years of war with Spain, of ships commandeered by the crown, of men in positions of power deciding that a small colony on the far side of the ocean was not the priority, had meant that White's repeated, desperate attempts to return had come to almost nothing. He had scraped together this voyage. He had pleaded and argued and negotiated just to be standing on this deck at all. And now, with the word CROATOAN pointing south, with the answer so close he could almost touch it, the men who controlled the ships decided they were done. The storm was real. The danger was real. One of the ships lost an anchor in the rough water near the shore. The captains were not monsters. They were practical men making practical calculations, and their calculations did not include spending another season on this coast looking for people who might be dead. White begged. That's not too strong a word. He appealed to them, he argued, he pointed to the carved word and said, "They went to CROATOAN Island, it is right there, 50 miles, we can be there in a day, please." The answer was no. They would winter in the Caribbean. They would return to CROATOAN in the spring. They did not return in the spring. The ships went to the Caribbean and then back to England, and John White went with them because he had no choice, because he was one man on someone else's ship in the middle of the Atlantic, because the ocean does not negotiate. He never came back. Let that sit for a moment, because I want you to feel the full weight of it. John White, the man who had helped plan this colony, who had led these people across an ocean, who had left his daughter and newborn granddaughter on the edge of a wilderness because the colony needed him to go to England, never returned to the Americas. He never walked the shores of Roanoke again. He never sailed to CROATOAN Island. He never knocked on a door and found Eleanor on the other side of it. He never held Virginia Dare, who would have been growing up, learning to talk, learning to walk, learning the world in whatever language the world around her was speaking. He went back to Ireland, where he had property, and he wrote letters. And the letters are extraordinary documents in their own quiet way, because they are the letters of a man carrying something too heavy to put down. In one letter, written after his return, he speaks of the colony and the people he left behind, and the language he uses is the language of a man who has accepted that he may never know, who has settled into a grief that has no resolution because it has no information. He writes about leaving the fate of the colonists to the merciful help of the Almighty, which is what you write when you have run out of earthly options. He died around 1593. Probably. The historical record of his death is itself uncertain, which feels appropriate in a story that refuses to give clean endings. He was somewhere in Ireland. He was in his 50s. And he died not knowing whether his daughter was alive, not knowing whether Virginia Dare had grown up or grown old or grown into something entirely new on the other side of the ocean. Virginia Dare would have been about 6 when White last saw the Carolina coast through the fog, the word CROATOAN receding behind him. If she survived, if she made it to wherever the colonists went next, if she grew up at all. There is something almost unbearable about that, and I don't want to rush past it. Because this is not just a historical mystery we're telling, it's a family story. A grandfather who went to get help and couldn't get back in time. A daughter and a son-in-law left in a wilderness with a baby. A little girl named Virginia who was too young to understand why her grandfather left and too young to understand why he didn't come back. Whatever happened to those 115 people, whatever the carved word on the fence post was pointing toward, John White spent the rest of his life in the dark about it. The answer, whatever it was always just slightly out of reach. 50 miles across a storm-tossed sea. One more voyage he couldn't make. That is not the grand tragedy of history. That is the quiet, ordinary, devastating tragedy of a man separated from his family by weather and other people's decisions, denied the chance to know. And 4 centuries later, sitting with his letters and his watercolor maps and the single carved word that was supposed to be an answer but became instead another question, we are still sitting with him in the dark. Here is where it gets genuinely interesting. Because CROATOAN is not the end of the story, it is, in many ways, the beginning of it. A word carved into a post in 1590 set off 400 years of wondering, and the wondering has produced some remarkable things. Not a definitive answer, but a constellation of possibilities, each one illuminating a different facet of what might have happened to 115 people in the Carolina wilderness, and each one saying something different about who those people were and what they chose, or what was chosen for them. Let's go through them slowly. Let's sit with each one. Theory 1. Integration with the CROATOAN people. This is the one that historians currently find most compelling, and I want to tell you why. Because the reasons are layered and interesting and, if you're willing to let them in, genuinely moving. The Croatoan people lived on Croatoan Island, now Hatteras Island, roughly 50 miles from Roanoke. They were not strangers to the English colonists. Manteo, one of the most significant figures in this whole story, was Croatoan. He had traveled to England. He spoke English. He had been baptized into the Church of England and given a lordship over the land in a ceremony that mixed European political traditions with a situation those traditions were entirely unprepared for. He was a bridge, a translator, a human point of contact between two worlds that were still learning to see each other. The colonists liked the Croatoan. They had had conflicts with other native nations. There had been a tense and tragic incident involving a village called dismantled, a misunderstanding that had ended in violence, but the Croatoan had been allies. And when supplies ran low, when the promised ship from England didn't come, when a year passed and then another and the colonists began to understand that they were on their own, the Croatoan island would have looked like the most reasonable option. Go to the people who know us. Go to the people who have food and shelter and knowledge of this land. Go to where we are not strangers. The lack of a cross above the carved word is, under this theory, not just evidence of a safe departure. It is evidence of a voluntary one. A chosen one. The colonists were not fleeing in terror. They were making a decision. They packed what they could carry, cached what they couldn't, took down their houses so the timber could be useful later, and walked toward the people who could help them survive. If this is what happened, then the story of Roanoke is not a tragedy. It is a survival story. 115 people, abandoned by their government, running low on food, surrounded by wilderness, made a sensible choice and walked toward their allies. They may have lived. They may have raised children. They may have grown old on Croatoan Island, speaking a language that was half English and half Croatoan, eating food they had learned to grow in a new soil, becoming something that was neither fully English nor fully native but entirely its own thing. And there is evidence, not conclusive, but suggestive and growing, that this is exactly what happened. The Lumbee people of North Carolina have maintained, across generations, oral traditions of English ancestry. They have spoken for centuries of ancestors who were different, who came from somewhere else, who brought knowledge and words in ways that were not originally theirs. For a long time, this was dismissed by European historians who were not in the habit of taking native oral history seriously. That dismissal is itself a kind of historical tragedy. Because oral history, when you actually sit down and listen to it, turns out to be extraordinarily reliable. There has been DNA work done on Lumbee populations, and while the results are complex and not yet definitive, there is evidence of European ancestry consistent with late 16th century contact. Not 20th century contact, not 19th century contact. The genetic markers suggest something earlier. Something that could be consistent with a group of English people living among and marrying into a native community in the 1590s. I find this theory beautiful, and I want to be honest about why. Because if the colonists survived by integrating into the Croatoan community, it means the story of Roanoke, often told as a loss, a disappearance, a failure, is actually a story about people finding a way. About a community that chose survival over pride, that walked toward strangers and became family. That is not a story of the New World swallowing English settlers. That is a story of people becoming something new because the world required it of them. Theory 2, moved inland and assimilated. The Croatoan Island theory and the inland theory are not entirely separate. They may be two chapters of the same story, or they may describe different groups of colonists who made different choices. The evidence for an inland movement is intriguing and frustrating in equal measure. In the early years of the Jamestown colony, established in 1607, almost 2 decades after Roanoke's disappearance, English settlers began collecting stories from the native people they encountered. And some of those stories mention something remarkable: communities further inland where people lived who were not quite like other native peoples. People with gray eyes. People who knew how to use European tools. People who built their houses in a particular way that no local tradition would explain. Some of these accounts are vague and easy to dismiss as wishful thinking. English colonists desperately wanting the Roanoke settlers to be alive, reading ambiguous stories as confirmation of what they hoped. And that wishful thinking has definitely distorted some of the historical analysis. You have to be careful with it. But some of the accounts are specific. There is a document from 1609 in which a Jamestown leader describes hearing about a native settlement where people had certain clearly European tools and practices. There are second-hand reports that name specific locations. There is just enough detail in just enough sources to make the inland theory worth taking seriously. The image this creates, if it's true, is extraordinary. A group of English colonists, perhaps a subset of the original 115, making their way inland from the coast, deeper into the Carolina wilderness, finding a native community willing to take them in, settling there, marrying into the community, having children who grew up speaking a native language and knowing English hunting songs and planting European seeds in American soil. It is the image of worlds colliding and producing something new and entirely unpredictable. Theory 3. Violence. I want to be honest about this one, because the honest historian has to sit with it even when it's uncomfortable. There is a theory that some or all of the Roanoke colonists were killed. Specifically, that they were killed by the Powhatan Confederacy, the powerful alliance of native nations centered in what is now Virginia, led by the man the English called Wahansanaka and sometimes, inaccurately, Powhatan. The primary evidence comes from a document dated to 1607, an account by a Jamestown colonist who claims that Wahansanaka himself admitted to having killed settlers who had been living with a southern tribe. The story goes that Wahansanaka's spiritual advisors had warned him that a great threat to his power would come from the south, and that he preemptively struck against communities in that region, including, allegedly, a group that may have been the Roanoke survivors. This is genuinely contested. The account is secondhand. Wahansanaka had reasons to project power and authority to the English, and admitting to killing their lost colonists might have been a deliberate act of intimidation rather than a confession of actual events. The story could be accurate. It could be exaggerated. It could be entirely invented. And it's worth noting that violence and integration are not mutually exclusive. Some colonists may have been killed. Others may have escaped and found refuge elsewhere. The 115 people of Roanoke were not necessarily all in the same place when whatever happened happened. They might have scattered. They might have made different choices and met different fates. History is not tidy, and the Roanoke mystery may not have one answer. It may have many. Theory 4. Lost at sea. Before White left in 1587, the colonists had a small pinnace, a light sailing vessel, that was to remain behind. Some researchers believe that a group of colonists may have attempted to use this boat to sail back to England when it became clear that no relief ship was coming. If they tried, they almost certainly died. The Atlantic Ocean in a small pinnace, without experienced deep-sea navigation, without charts of the deep ocean, in the late 16th century, that is not a voyage. That is a disappearance in slow motion. The Atlantic does not forgive optimism. It does not make exceptions for desperation. A small group of people who had never navigated the open ocean, pointing their boat east and hoping, that story ends in the water, probably within days, and leaves no trace. I find this the saddest of the theories, because it describes people who were trying to go home. People so desperate to get back to England, to get back to something familiar and safe, that they climbed into a small boat on an enormous ocean and tried. There is courage in that, and also heartbreak, and also the particular kind of human desperation that makes you do the thing you know probably won't work because doing nothing feels worse. If some of the colonists died at sea, they left no word. No carved message. Just the ocean and the absence of an answer. Theory 5. The happy ending hidden in the mystery. This one is not quite a separate theory. It is more like the optimistic reading of Theory 1. The full and glorious version of the integration story, taken to its most hopeful conclusion. The colonists survived. They walked to Croatoan Island, and they were taken in, and they lived. They had children with Croatoan spouses. Those children had children. Those grandchildren grew up speaking a language that wove English and Croatoan together in ways we can only guess at now. They planted English seeds in Carolina soil and learned to fish the way the Croatoan fished and told their children stories about a place called England that became more mythological with every generation, a distant island across an impossible ocean where their grandparents had come from. And Siain, carved into that fence post in 1590, was not a cry for help. It was not a desperate message scratched by people fleeing into the unknown. It was a statement. a destination. A choice made deliberately by people who looked at the wilderness around them and looked at the allies who were willing to take them in and said, "We know where we're going. We're fine. We're going to make something work." If that is what happened, and I want to be careful not to overstate the evidence, but it is possible, it is within the range of what the evidence supports, then the story of Roanoke is not a mystery about 115 people who disappeared. It is a story about 115 people who arrived, who became part of something, whose DNA is walking around North Carolina right now, for centuries later, in people who may not know exactly where that particular thread of their ancestry leads, but who carry it all the same. That is the most beautiful version of the story. And I am not going to tell you it's definitely true, because that would be dishonest. But I'm going to tell you that it might be. And sometimes might be is enough to make you feel something. The thing about archaeology is that it works slowly. Exquisitely, maddeningly slowly. And the slow pace of it is not a flaw. It is a feature, it is the entire point, because the soil does not lie, and the soil does not exaggerate, and the soil has been keeping the secrets of Roanoke for 430 years with the patience of something that does not experience time the way we do. The First Colony Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to finding archaeological answers to the Roanoke mystery, has been doing careful, methodical work at Hatteras Island, the place that was once CROATOAN Island, for years. And what they have been finding is not a smoking gun. It is not a signed confession from history. But it is something. And something, when you have been searching for 4 centuries, feels like a great deal. A signet ring. That is one of the things they found. A copper and brass signet ring of clearly European origin, the kind of ring that a person of some social standing would have worn, found in a layer of soil consistent with the late 16th century. A ring like that does not belong in the soil of Hatteras Island unless a European put it there. And the European who put it there, who lost it or left it or traded it away or had it taken, was almost certainly there within a generation of 1587. A piece of slate with faint English writing scratched into it. The letters are not entirely legible because 4 centuries of soil and moisture have done their work, but they are recognizably English letters in a style consistent with the 16th century. Someone was writing in English on CROATOAN Island. Someone was carving English words into slate in a place where English people were not supposed to be. Copper items. Trade goods of European manufacture, found in contexts that suggest they arrived as deliberate trade rather than much later contact. The kind of items that English colonists would have brought to trade, found in layers of soil that predate sustained English contact with this region. Ground-penetrating radar, one of archaeology's quieter miracles, the ability to look into the earth without disturbing it, has revealed structures beneath the soil of Hatteras Island that are not consistent with known native building traditions of that region and period. Structures that might be something. That might be the outlines of buildings, the foundations of a life lived here by people who built the way the English built. None of this is conclusive. I want to say that clearly, because I care about honesty more than I care about a tidy story. None of the individual pieces of evidence, standing alone, proves that the Roanoke colonists came to CROATOAN Island and lived there. But evidence rarely proves things in isolation. Evidence works the way a picture works. You need many small dots before the image resolves. And the dots are accumulating. Slowly, carefully, with the painstaking attention of people who know that rushing archaeology is how you destroy the very thing you're trying to find, the picture is beginning to form. The DNA work is perhaps the most fascinating and the most fraught. Genetic analysis of Lumbee populations, the largest native nation east of the Mississippi, centered in North Carolina, has been ongoing, and the results are complex. There is European ancestry in the Lumbee genome that does not fit neatly into patterns of post-colonial contact. There are genetic markers that suggest early and sustained contact with Europeans, consistent with something happening in the late 16th century rather than the 18th or 19th. This does not prove Roanoke. It is consistent with Roanoke. It is consistent with a group of English people marrying into a native community in the 1590s and their descendants marrying out into surrounding communities over the following generations. The Lumbee themselves have been saying this for a long time, in the language of oral tradition rather than genetic markers. They have maintained stories of English ancestry, of ancestors who were different, of a mixing that happened long ago and far from European record-keeping. For most of American history, those stories were not taken seriously by the historians doing the official accounting of the past. The genetic work is, in part, a way of the official record catching up to what people have been saying all along. What strikes me, sitting with all of this, the signet ring, the slate, the copper goods, the radar, the DNA, the oral histories, is how much evidence there is of something happening, and how carefully that something is still hiding from us. 430 years is a long time. It is long enough for a settlement to become forest. Long enough for a language to dissolve into another language. Long enough for a story to become a memory, and a memory to become a tradition, and a tradition to become a feeling that something important happened here, even if the details have softened with time. We are not there yet. We have not found the answer. But we are finding the edges of the answer. We are finding the shape of it. And the people doing that work, carefully, in the Carolina soil, with brushes and radar and test tubes and respectful listening to the communities whose ancestors were part of the story, are doing something that matters. They are asking a question that is 4 centuries old with the tools of a century that didn't exist when the question was first asked. And the question, slowly, is beginning to answer back. Let me ask you something before we get to the end of this. What does it mean to begin something and never finish it? Because that is, on one level, what the Roanoke story is. The first serious English attempt to plant a permanent settlement in the Americas, the attempt that was supposed to be the beginning of something vast and permanent and world-changing, and it vanished. It didn't fail spectacularly. It didn't burn. It didn't send back a message of defeat. It simply ceased quietly in the space between one voyage and the next, leaving nothing but a carved word and 4 centuries of questions. Roanoke sits at the beginning of the American story like an asterisk, or like a breath held before a sentence. Everything that came after, Jamestown, Plymouth, the whole enormous complicated history of what European settlement meant and did and became, came after this first strange silence. America began, in some sense, with a disappearance, with a gap, with a mystery that no one could solve. That is not an accident, I think. That is not incidental to the story. Because the Americas were not empty when the English arrived, and the story of European settlement is not a story of people arriving on blank land and writing their names on it. It is a story of collision, of worlds meeting and misunderstanding each other and trading and fighting and loving and absorbing each other in ways that no one entirely intended and no one entirely controlled. And Roanoke, with its carved word and its silent settlement and its unanswerable questions, captures that collision at its most raw and unresolved. What does it mean that the most likely answer, that the colonists survived by becoming part of the world they found, is also the answer that most complicates the simple story of conquest and settlement? Because the simple story, the story that was told for a long time, goes like this. Europeans came to the Americas and built a civilization on a new continent. That story has a certain clean momentum to it. It moves in one direction. But if the Roanoke colonists survived by integrating into a native community, the story moves in all directions at once. It says that the encounter between European settlers and native peoples was not always one of displacement and destruction, that sometimes, in the space before the larger forces of empire arrived, something more human happened. People met other people. They needed each other. They learned each other's languages and ate each other's food and had children together and became something that didn't have a name yet because it was too new. Virginia Dare. If she survived, if she grew up on Croatoan Island or somewhere inland, if she lived past her 3rd birthday and her 6th and her 10th and into adulthood, grew up speaking a native language. She probably spoke English too, or fragments of it, the words her parents remembered from another world. But the language of her daily life, the language she thought in and dreamed in and used to name the things around her, would have been the language of the community that raised her. She would have known how to fish these waters and read this sky and find food in this forest. She would have been English by ancestry and American, truly, complexly, specifically American, by everything else. Maybe that is not a tragedy. I want to say that plainly, even though it has taken the historical imagination a long time to get there. Maybe a little girl named Virginia, growing up in a Carolina community in the 1590s, becoming something entirely new, is not a story of loss. Maybe it is a story of transformation. Of the particular thing that happens when worlds collide and the collision doesn't destroy either one but produces instead something unexpected and entirely its own. That is what Roanoke means to me, sitting with it across 4 centuries. It is the place where the American story admits that it is more complicated than it likes to appear. More tangled. More human. Less about triumph and more about the messy, beautiful, irreducible fact of people trying to survive in a world that was larger than their maps of it. Come back with me one more time, to that shore. August 1590. John White stands on the beach of Roanoke Island, and the Atlantic is behind him, and the forest is ahead, and in his hand or before his eyes is a fence post with a word carved into it. CROATOAN. The sun is the kind of sun that August brings to the Carolina coast, heavy and warm and indifferent to the particular sadness of the man standing in it. The gulls are doing what they always do. The water is doing what it always does. He doesn't know what the word means, exactly. He knows what it points to. He knows the island, the people, the friendly face of Manteo. But he doesn't know what he will find there. He doesn't know if his daughter is there, sitting outside a house she has built from different materials than she expected, telling a child who is the right age to be Virginia a story in a language that is already beginning to mix with another language. He doesn't know if they are there at all. He doesn't know if anyone is coming back from this disappearance. He stood there with hope and uncertainty in equal measure, which is, I think, the most honest place to stand in the face of a mystery this large. We are still standing there with him, in a way. We have 4 centuries of additional wondering. We have archaeology and genetics and oral history and ground-penetrating radar. We have people who carry in their DNA a thread that might lead back to this beach, this fence post, this word. And we still do not have the definitive answer. We still do not know, with the certainty that history likes to pretend it offers, what happened to 115 people, including a 3-year-old girl named Virginia, who was the first English child born in the Americas, whose grandfather loved her more than any voyage, and who was somewhere in that forest, alive or not yet lost, when the ships sailed back across the ocean. But I'll tell you what I believe, sitting with all of it, having followed this story into every corner I can reach. I believe they went to CROATOAN. I believe they walked south with what they could carry and found the people who were willing to take them in. I believe some of them lived long lives in a place they came to think of as home. I believe Virginia Dare grew up. I believe she grew up into someone remarkable and unclassifiable and entirely her own, in the way that people who grow up between worlds sometimes are. I believe she had children. I believe those children had children. I believe that somewhere in the DNA of people living in North Carolina today, there is a thread, thin, ancient, patient, that leads back to this beach, this word, this grandfather standing in August light with his heart in his throat. And I believe that thread is waiting to be read. Not by me, and probably not by you, but by the careful, patient people with their radar and their test tubes and their respectful attention to the stories that communities have been keeping alive through the centuries when no one official was writing them down. The answer is not gone. It is not destroyed or erased. It has just been waiting in the soil and the blood and the memory of people, for someone patient enough and humble enough and scientifically careful enough to find it. That is the particular grace of this mystery. Unlike so many things that the past has swallowed, Roanoke may still be answerable. The answer may be living and breathing and walking around in the world right now, in people who are the distant, many times great-grandchildren of Eleanor and Ananias and Virginia Dare and the other 112 souls who stood on this shore in 1587 and decided to make something work. I find that genuinely, quietly beautiful. And I hope you do too. Now rest. The forest keeps its secrets well. But not forever. Because every mystery is really just a story waiting for someone patient enough to listen. And the most